When President Donald Trump suddenly announced his desire to buy Greenland, the whole world burst into laughter. Denmark called it a ridiculous idea, and Western media treated it as a joke. However, if we look deeper into the economic history and military strategy, we will see that this was not just an impromptu statement from Donald Trump, but truly a story of the century and also very practical. Greenland is not just a frozen island sitting isolated in the North Atlantic. With an area of 2.16 million square kilometers, it is the largest landmass in the world that is not a continent, about 50 times larger than Denmark, the country that governs it. More importantly, it lies between North America and Europe, controlling vital air and sea routes. And of course, the Americans understand very well the value of this island, having maintained an Air Force base there, one of the most important strategic bases since the Cold War. With the state of the melting ice, Greenland is increasingly becoming a crucial gateway to control the Arctic region, which holds vast untapped oil and gas reserves. In fact, the United States has attempted to buy Greenland at least twice before. In 1867, Washington considered purchasing Greenland and Iceland from Denmark, but the idea was quickly forgotten. Then, in 1946, President Harry Truman proposed paying $100 million, equivalent to about $1.4 billion today, to acquire the island. At that time, the United States was very afraid of the Soviet Union and wanted Greenland to become a shield to protect North America, but Denmark once again politely declined. Then, more than a century later, Donald Trump revived this idea with enormous offers. But the Danish government and the people of Greenland strongly opposed it, causing the deal to quickly hit a dead end. If one day the United States truly wants to make an offer that can't be refused, how much would Greenland be valued? To understand its value, we must compare it to past deals. For example, in the early 19th century, the United States purchased Louisiana from France for $15 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be around $350 million for an area of 2.14 million square kilometers. In 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. An area of 1.72 million square kilometers, which would be roughly equivalent to less than $150 million today. If we apply similar pricing, Greenland could be valued at least $500 billion. But that's considering only the land value, not including any other potential factors. This island not only has land and ice, but it also possesses a wealth of resources, including oil, gas, rare earth minerals, and seafood. Estimates suggest that Greenland holds around 17.5 billion barrels of untapped oil, not to mention millions of tons of rare earth minerals, which are crucial for high-tech industries. If we consider only the oil and gas resources, the value of this island exceeds $1,000 billion. This is more than twice the GDP of Vietnam, and for the United States, that amount is relatively small. Another way to estimate its value is by looking at Greenland's economy. Currently, the island's GDP is only about $3 billion per year. If we use the business valuation method, which is typically around 30 times the annual GDP, Greenland could be valued at about $90 billion. However, some analysts believe that if the U.S. wants to fully purchase Greenland in another way, they could use a different approach. That is, paying $2 million for each Greenlandic citizen to get their consent, which would cost the U.S. around $112 billion to persuade the people of Greenland to agree to join the U.S. So if we consider all the factors, a reasonable price for the U.S. to purchase Greenland could range from $100 billion to $1,000 billion, depending on the method of valuation. However, even with such a sum, would Denmark actually sell? In theory, Denmark has to subsidize $600 million every year to support Greenland's economy, and selling the island could provide them with a huge sum of money. But in reality, it's not that simple. Greenland is currently a self-governing territory, and its people do not want to become part of the United States. They see themselves as a distinct nation with an independent cultural identity, and the idea of being sold like a commodity is something they cannot accept. Additionally, if Denmark loses Greenland, it will also lose its important geopolitical position in the Arctic, a region that is increasingly becoming a fierce battleground between the US, Russia, and China. So, What would happen if the US actually succeeded in buying Greenland? Economically, the island could either become the 51st state of the United States or be treated as a special territory, like Puerto Rico. The U.S. would gain complete control of the Arctic, strengthening its military and economic position while eliminating the risks posed by Russia and China. Countries eager to enter the region would also race to exploit its resources. As for Denmark, it would lose its geopolitical standing, but in return, it could receive hundreds of billions of dollars to invest in other sectors. However, this would certainly send shockwaves around the world and escalate tensions with Russia and China, countries that also have ambitions to expand their influence in the Arctic. While this idea is still just on paper, from a geopolitical, economic, and military perspective, it could very well be a reasonable move for the U.S. in the future. If one day, Washington offers $1,000 billion, would Denmark be swayed? The answer remains uncertain, but certainly, if the deal succeeds, it would become the largest real estate transaction in human history. If they can't buy it, will they force the issue? This could be a strategy the U.S. might pursue. Could the U.S. annex Greenland through a referendum? In theory, this is entirely possible. But in practice, it is a scenario full of difficulties and challenges. If they can't buy it with money, the U.S. might try a different strategy, organizing a referendum. History has seen many territories annexed by other nations through referendums, whether legal or controversial. Crimea is the most recent example. In 2014, after Russia deployed its military to Crimea, the local government held a vote, and more than 96% of the population supported joining Russia. Ukraine and the West called it a fraudulent referendum, but Russia deemed it legal and officially annexed the Crimea territory. Before that, East Timor separated from Indonesia through a referendum under the supervision of the United Nations, and it became an independent nation. Greenland, in theory, could follow this path if one day its people wanted to leave Denmark and join the United States. As mentioned, if the U.S. were to pay each Greenlandic citizen $2 million, it would only cost a small amount relative to the resources of the United States. But would the people of Greenland actually want that? The most crucial factor in the scenario of annexing Greenland through a referendum is the will of its people. Do they want to become Americans? Currently, Greenland has about 56,000 residents, most of whom are indigenous Inuit people. Since 1979, they have been granted extensive self-government. To this day, many Greenlanders still aspire for full independence from Denmark rather than being controlled by another great power. Some surveys indicate that the majority of Greenlanders do not want to become Americans. The main reason behind this concern is the fear of losing their identity, as Greenlanders still have a distinct culture, and they fear being Americanized if they were to join the U.S. Additionally, they do not trust how the U.S. treats indigenous people. Policies toward Native Alaskans or Native Americans have not always been positive, and this history causes many Greenlanders to feel deeply concerned. Another reason is the fear that Greenland would be turned into a massive U.S. military base, similar to what has happened with Guam or Puerto Rico. If this were to happen, Greenland could become a front line against Russia, potentially making it a target in future conflicts. In other words, Russian missiles could be aimed at Greenland. Even if the people of Greenland wanted a referendum on joining the U.S., the big question is whether Denmark would accept it. Although Greenland has constitutional autonomy, it is still part of Denmark. If a referendum were held without Copenhagen's consent, the Danish government could declare it illegal, just as Spain did with Catalonia. Denmark could also apply economic and political pressure to prevent the vote from happening. And then there's the European Union. If an EU member state were to lose territory to the US, it would be a seismic shock in Europe. The EU would certainly not sit idly by and let Greenland become part of the United States. If a forced referendum is not pursued, the US still has another approach, negotiating with Denmark to reach an agreement. One possible scenario is that the U.S. could offer a massive financial proposal to allow Greenland to hold a referendum, with Denmark unable to refuse. In exchange, the U.S. could commit to guaranteeing the freedoms and rights of the Greenlandic people, rather than immediately pursuing annexation. However, even if the U.S. manages to convince Denmark, the story is far from over. Russia and China would certainly not sit idle. The Arctic is one of the top strategic regions that both Russia, the US, and China all want to control. If Washington were to annex Greenland, they would have an ideal foothold to dominate the entire region, something that Russia would not tolerate. When Russia annexed Crimea, the West responded with sanctions. But if the US were to do something similar with Greenland, would Russia retaliate by encouraging separatist movements somewhere else as a countermeasure? China is also a crucial factor. China had previously attempted to invest in Greenland, building mineral extraction projects and infrastructure, but Denmark rejected and blocked these efforts. If the US succeeds in making Greenland a part of itself, China might fund resistance movements or use economic measures to put pressure on the US. With numerous political, economic, and geopolitical barriers, using a referendum to annex Greenland would be an incredibly difficult goal. To achieve this, the US would need to ensure three key factors. First, the US would need to convince the people of Greenland that joining America is a better option than remaining with Denmark. Once the people are on board, second, they would need to find a way to make Denmark accept the reality without causing a severe diplomatic crisis. Third, after achieving these two factors, the US would have to deal with a strong backlash from Russia and China. Therefore, unless there is a major political upheaval or Greenland faces a severe economic crisis, the scenario of the US using a referendum to annex Greenland is nearly impossible in the near future. However, if one day the US makes an offer that cannot be refused, history could take an unexpected turn.